Security escorted my father-in-law out of his own school on a Tuesday morning in October, and I watched from the hallway with my son's small hand in mine, while two men in uniform walked the principal of Hargrove Elementary through the front door like he was a stranger who had wandered in off the street. My son looked up at me with those wide brown eyes and asked, quietly, the way 8-year-olds ask things when they already sense something large has happened, "Is Grandpa going to be okay?" I didn't have a clean answer for that. Some people who heard the full story later told me I went too far. I want you to decide for yourself. Let me tell you how we got here. The room where it started was his office. Plaques on every wall. A framed photo of the school's state literacy award from 3 years back, his name on the matting below it. A desk that had clearly been chosen to communicate authority. He sat behind it the way men sit behind things they've decided belong to them, and I sat across from him in a chair that was just slightly lower than his, which I am certain was not an accident. His name was Gerald Holt. He was my husband's father, not my father, not anyone's blood relation to me. My father-in-law by marriage, a distinction that was going to matter more than he understood when he looked at me that morning and said those words. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Nora Scott. I have been Nora Scott my entire adult life, which means I kept my name when I married Daniel Holt 7 years ago, a decision Gerald found quietly offensive from the beginning and never stopped finding offensive. Daniel thought it was charming. His mother, Beverly Holt, thought it was a statement. Gerald thought it was a provocation. It was none of those things. It was just my name. I had been building things under that name for years before Daniel and I met, and I saw no reason to dismantle the architecture of my professional life, because I had fallen in love with a good man whose father happened to believe that a wife's name should follow her husband's like a footnote. Our son's name is Theo. Theodore James Scott Holt, which was the compromise Daniel and I reached before he was born, a hyphen that satisfied nobody fully and therefore, as compromises go, was probably fair. Theo was 8 years old on the morning this story begins, enrolled in 2nd grade at Hargrove Elementary, where his paternal grandfather had served as principal for 11 years. That was a fact presented to me early in our relationship as a benefit. "He'll always have someone looking out for him there," Beverly had said, touching my arm with a warmth that I think she genuinely felt. I smiled. I had learned by then what Beverly's warmth cost and what it expected in return. The school sits on the north side of town, in a neighborhood of older oak trees and wide sidewalks. It's a good school by most measures, genuinely good, which is the detail that makes everything that followed more complicated and not less. Gerald Holt was not a bad educator. He had built something real at Hargrove. The literacy scores were legitimate. The teachers mostly loved working there. When he walked the hallways, he remembered the names of children whose parents he had met only once, and that is not nothing. I want to be clear about that before I tell you what he did, because the story is not about a bad principal. It is about a man who had lived so long inside his own authority that he had stopped being able to see where it ended. Daniel and I met at a mutual friend's dinner party in the spring, 8 years before this story. I was 31, he was 33. We were seated next to each other because our friend Camille thought we were both too serious and needed to be loosened up, and she was right about both of us in different ways. Daniel was serious in the way that engineers are serious, methodical, and precise, and genuinely delighted by systems that worked correctly. I was serious in a different way. I had been building a small real estate consulting practice for 4 years by that point, mostly acquisition work for mid-size investors who needed someone to evaluate properties they didn't have the bandwidth to assess themselves. I was not wealthy. I was comfortable and growing and deeply invested in the work in a way that felt, for the first time in my adult life, like actual forward motion. We were engaged 18 months later. Gerald's reaction to the engagement was gracious in the technical sense of the word. He shook my hand. He said he was happy for Daniel. He offered to take us to dinner at a restaurant he liked, a place with white tablecloths and a wine list that he clearly knew well, and over that dinner, he asked me 4 questions about my work and 14 questions about whether Daniel and I had discussed where we planned to live. It was possible, I told myself on the drive home, that he was simply a man who expressed concern through logistics. It was possible he was nervous. It was possible I was reading professional wariness into social awkwardness. I gave him every generous interpretation I had. I was going to be his daughter-in-law. I wanted to be fair. The first time I understood that his interest in logistics was something else, we had been married 4 months. Daniel and I had found a house in a neighborhood 15 minutes from his parents, which felt like the right distance, close enough for Sundays and holidays and the easy geography of family, far enough to have a door we could close. Gerald had opinions about the house. He thought the foundation needed to be inspected by someone specific, a contractor he knew, a man named Walt whose opinion Gerald trusted the way you trust someone who has never disagreed with you. We had already had the inspection done. It came back clean. I told Gerald this. He looked at the inspection report the way you look at a document produced by an institution you don't recognize, with a polite skepticism that was mostly about who had produced it rather than what it said. Walt has seen things these chain companies miss, he told me. I thanked him. I did not call Walt. 3 weeks later, Gerald mentioned in passing that he had asked Walt to drive by and take a look from the street, just to put his own mind at ease. I was standing at Beverly's kitchen counter when he said it. I set down my coffee cup carefully, and I looked at my husband, and Daniel looked at me, and then he looked at his father and said, "Dad, that's not necessary." And Gerald said, "It's already done." That was the first incident. I marked it internally not as an attack, but as information. The second incident came 6 months later and involved money in a way that was meant to feel like generosity. Gerald and Beverly offered to contribute to a college fund for the baby we were expecting. This was, genuinely, a kind offer. Beverly made it the way she made most things, warmly and without obvious condition. Gerald made it the way he made most things, with a structural requirement attached. The contribution would go into an account that he and Beverly would co-manage with us, a joint arrangement, so that the funds could be administered with what he called appropriate family oversight. I was 7 months pregnant and sitting on their living room couch, and I looked at the word oversight from a very particular angle that afternoon. I told him we appreciated the thought and that we would discuss it. After Theo was born, I opened a 529 account in my name as custodian, made an initial contribution of $8,000 from my own practice earnings, and began contributing monthly. I told Gerald and Beverly about the account warmly, as a fait accompli, and said we were so grateful they had inspired us to get it started. Beverly hugged me. Gerald's smile had a quality I recognized by then, the quality of a man who has discovered that a door he expected to open was already closed. The account had been growing for 8 years by the time this story reaches its crisis point. Quietly and steadily, the way things grow when no one else has a key to them. Theo was born healthy and enormous and opinionated from the first week of his life. He had Daniel's precision, and I liked to think, my instinct for when something was wrong. He was the kind of child who noticed things. Not loudly, not with performance, but with the particular attention of a child who has learned that the world contains more information than most people announce out loud. By the time he was in 2nd grade, he had 2 close friends, a loose attachment to a chapter book series about a detective raccoon, and a habit of sitting at the edge of the playground to watch the geometry of how other kids moved around each other before he joined in. His teacher that year, a woman named Ms. Florinda Ibarra, who I want to mention by name because she handled the weeks that followed with a professionalism and dignity that deserves acknowledgement, told me at the first parent conference that Theo had excellent situational awareness and a strong sense of fairness. She said it like a compliment, which it was. I already knew it. It was the thing about him I was most proud of and most worried about in equal measure, because a strong sense of fairness in an 8-year-old is a gift that the world has not yet decided to fully reward. The girl's name was Adiz Obi. She was also in 2nd grade, a quiet child who wore her hair in 2 neat braids and who, according to Theo when he explained the situation to me later in the specific factual way that he reported things, had been having a problem with another girl on the playground for several weeks. The other girl's name was Lily Holt, Gerald and Beverly's biological granddaughter through their daughter Renee, which made her Theo's first cousin on his father's side. Lily was 8 years old, same as Theo and Adiz, and she was by all accounts a perfectly pleasant child in most contexts. At home she was, by Beverly's description, spirited. In the classroom she was, by Ms. Ibarra's careful neutral phrasing, socially complex. On the playground, according to the footage I would eventually watch on a laptop screen in Gerald Holt's office, She had been making Adiz Obi's recesses quietly miserable for the better part of a month. I did not know any of this when it was happening. That is important. Theo did not come home and report it. Theo processed things internally before he acted on them, which was a quality I recognized because I had spent 8 years watching Gerald Holt treat it as evidence of weakness. Theo was not weak. He was observing. And then, on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of September, he stopped observing and did something instead. What he did, as I understood it from his account and from what I later saw, was straightforward. Lily had taken Adiz's book, the one Adiz brought to read during free choice time on the playground bench, and had held it above her head and then dropped it in a puddle while 2 other girls watched. Adiz had not cried, which I thought about later, that specific detail, the way a child who has been dealing with something for long enough learns not to cry in front of the person doing it. Theo had walked over. He had picked up the book and given it back to Adiz. He had told Lily, in the specific words he reported to me later, "That was mean and you should say sorry." Lily had not said sorry. She had told Theo to mind his own business. Theo had said, "It is my business because I saw it." And then a playground monitor had arrived and separated them, and the incident had been noted in the way that such incidents are noted, in a log that went to the front office, which was to say that it went to Gerald. I did not receive a call that day. I did not receive a call the following week. The first communication I received from the school was not a phone call at all. It was Gerald calling my cell phone on a Monday evening, 11 days after the playground incident, asking if I could come in the next morning before drop-off. His voice had the texture of professional neutrality, the specific register of a principal's voice, not a father-in-law's, and something in the gap between those 2 roles made me set down what I was doing and be very still for a moment before I said yes. I want to pause here and tell you something about those 11 days, because they matter. I had dinner with Daniel the Wednesday of that week, the week after the playground incident, and Theo told us both about what had happened in his careful, factual way over pasta. Daniel had looked at me across the table with a particular expression, the one he wore when he was calculating something that had multiple variables, and then he had looked at Theo and said, "You did the right thing, bud." I had agreed, wholeheartedly and immediately. We had talked to Theo about the difference between getting involved in something that was his business and inserting himself into situations that weren't, and Theo had listened and nodded and said, in the exact cadence of an 8-year-old who has already decided, "Adiz is in my class. It was my business." I had not argued with that. I had thought about it after he went to bed, and I had not found a flaw in his reasoning. What I had also done, that same Wednesday evening, after Theo was in bed and Daniel was in the other room, was send an email to an attorney named Jonathan Farrow, who had been my attorney for 7 years, since the early days of my consulting practice. Jonathan handled my business contracts, and more recently, had helped me draft an estate structure that I had put in place the previous spring, a process that had involved 2 months of careful documentation and a meeting on March 15, 2024, during which we had discussed, among other things, the trust structure I had established for Theo's benefit and the specific language governing who could and could not make decisions on Theo's behalf in various scenarios. Jonathan had asked me at that meeting whether I anticipated a specific challenge to Theo's interests from anyone in my family. I had told him, honestly, that I hoped not, but that I believed in having clean paperwork. He had agreed that clean paperwork was always wise. The documentation from that meeting was filed and organized, and it had nothing to do with what was happening on a second-grade playground in September. And yet I found myself, on that Wednesday evening, sending Jonathan a brief email that said only, "Flagging a situation at school, nothing formal yet, I will keep you updated." Jonathan responded the next morning, "Understood, I'm here." If you have ever been in a position where you felt something coming before you could name it, where your instincts had organized themselves into preparation before your conscious mind had caught up, you already know what that Wednesday evening felt like. I did not tell Daniel about the email to Jonathan. Not because I was hiding it from him, but because I had nothing concrete to tell yet, and Daniel was a man who preferred to address specific problems when they arrived rather than map contingencies in advance. It was one of the genuine differences between us, not a flaw in either direction, just a difference in how we process the world. Daniel saw problems. I saw architectures. He trusted that things would work out if you were reasonable. I trusted that things worked out when you had prepared for the possibility that they wouldn't. When Gerald called me that Monday evening, I already had 11 days of quiet preparation behind me, and what I said to him on the phone was, "Of course. What time works for you?" He said 8:15. Before the school day started. Before most of the teachers arrived. Before Theo would be dropped off. I thanked him and hung up, and I sat for a moment in the specific quiet of a decision that has already been made. Then I opened my laptop and reviewed the school's disciplinary policy, which was published on the district website and which I had gone through once before when Theo enrolled, in the way I went through documents, carefully and completely. Then I sent a second email to Jonathan Farrow, this one slightly longer. Then I went to bed. In the morning, I dropped Theo at my neighbor Alina Vasquez's house, asked her to take him to school with her own son at the regular time, and drove to Hargrove Elementary alone. I signed in at the front office with the visitor's log the way you always do, smiled at the administrative assistant, whose name was Deb and who had always been kind to Theo, and walked down the hall to Gerald's office. I noticed as I walked that the hallway security cameras were positioned at intervals of roughly 30 feet, covering the full length of the building, including the rear exit to the playground. I had noticed this before. I was noticing it again. Gerald's door was open. He was sitting behind his desk. He gestured to the chair across from him, the slightly lower one, and I sat down in it the way I sat down in most things, comfortably and without apology. He folded his hands on the desk. He said the words that are at the center of this story, the words I had come here for without knowing I was coming for them. "Your son caused trouble," he said. "He's expelled." I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not perform any of the responses he had, I think, anticipated. I sat very still, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the specific gravity of a moment that has been building for a long time finally arriving at its exact weight. I smiled. Calmly. The way you smile when you have been waiting for a door to open. "Before I leave," I said, "I need to show you something." I reached into my bag, and I took out my laptop, and I set it on his desk, and I turned it toward him. And on the screen was the security footage from the playground, obtained the previous Friday through a formal written request to the district office. A request I had submitted with a reference to the specific section of the district's records policy that entitled a parent of an enrolled student to request surveillance footage relevant to a reported disciplinary incident involving their child. A request that had been processed and fulfilled within 48 hours because the district policy required it, because I had read the policy and knew it required it, because Jonathan Farrow had confirmed in an email on Thursday morning that my interpretation of the policy was correct. The footage was clear. The timestamp was clear. The angle of the playground camera covered the bench, the puddle, and every person within 15 feet of both. Gerald Holt's face, as he watched the footage of his granddaughter holding a book above a smaller child's head and dropping it into standing water, and then watched my son walk over and pick it up and hand it back, did something I had not entirely anticipated. It did not go red with anger. It did not collapse into immediate guilt. What it did was go very still, the specific stillness of a man who has just understood the distance between the story he told himself and the story the camera tells, and found that distance to be much larger than he had believed. The footage also showed, in the final 30 seconds before the playground monitor arrived, something Gerald had perhaps not known was captured. His granddaughter, Lily, leaning toward Adiz one more time after Theo had stepped back, saying something that the camera could not record in audio, but that a child's posture communicates clearly enough without sound. Gerald's face turned a color that was not anger and not shame, but something that lived in the territory between them. Something that looked, from where I was sitting, a great deal like the specific expression of a man who has just realized that the authority he used this morning was not going to hold. I drove home from Hargrove Elementary that morning and sat in my car in the driveway for 4 minutes before going inside. Not because I was shaken. Because I needed to think clearly about the exact sequence of what had just happened and what it meant for the sequence of what was going to happen next, and I had learned over the years that the car, engine off, driveway empty, was where I thought most clearly. The house was quiet. Daniel had already left for work. Theo was at school. I had the morning to myself, and I needed to use it precisely. Let me tell you about what I had built, because it is the part of this story that Gerald Holt had no idea existed, and understanding it is the only way the rest of this makes sense. 4 years before Theo was born, when Daniel and I were still in the early years of our marriage, and I was still running my real estate consulting practice out of a rented desk in a shared office space on the east side of town, I had begun to notice something about the work I was doing for my clients. I was good at evaluation. I was specifically, measurably good at identifying properties that other buyers had walked away from for reasons that were more about presentation than substance. Properties with structural integrity and poor staging, or zoning adjacency issues that looked like liabilities from the outside, and read very differently if you understood how the municipal planning board in this particular county made its decisions. I had grown up watching my father, who was a civil engineer, read a piece of land the way some people read a face, and I had absorbed more of that than I realized until I started doing the work professionally and discovered that I was right more often than I had any business being right. My first acquisition on my own behalf was a duplex on Mariner Street, purchased in the spring, 6 years into my marriage. I paid $220,000 for it, financed it conventionally, renovated the upper unit over 4 months with a contractor named Pete Salinas, who I had used twice for client work and trusted completely, and had it rented within 3 weeks of completion. The lower unit was already tenanted and had been for 9 years, which was part of why I bought it. The property appraised 14 months later at $310,000. I did not tell the Holt family about it. I did not keep it secret out of strategy, at least not initially. I kept it private because it was mine, built from my own earnings and my own judgment, and I had developed over the years of my marriage a clear and quiet instinct that the things I built with my own hands needed to stay in my own hands, away from the gravitational pull of Gerald's oversight and Beverly's warm, expensive interest. The duplex was the beginning. Over the following 4 years, working carefully and without debt beyond what made mathematical sense, I added 2 more properties to what I had started thinking of, privately, as my portfolio. One was a small commercial unit in a strip center near the University District, purchased at a distressed price from an estate sale, leased to a physical therapy practice that had been looking for exactly that footprint for 2 years. The other was a single-family home in a neighborhood that I had watched for 18 months before the right listing appeared, bought, renovated minimally, and held as a long-term rental. The 3 properties together, as of the previous tax year, carried a combined assessed value of just over $1.1 million, against which I carried a total of $390,000 in mortgages. I was not a developer. I was not running a company. I was a woman who had spent 6 years making careful decisions with her own money and keeping her paperwork clean. Jonathan Farrow knew about all of it. He had handled the entity structure that held the properties, a limited liability company registered in my name alone, and he had helped me draft the estate documents the previous spring that designated the properties as assets of Theo's trust, to be administered on his behalf by me as trustee until he reached the age of 25. No other family member was named. No other family member had standing. Jonathan had walked me through every implication of that structure on March 15, 2024, in a 2-hour meeting that I had requested specifically, and he had confirmed, without my having to ask directly, that the structure was clean, complete, and not subject to challenge by anyone who had not contributed to the assets within it. I also want to tell you about Renata Voss, because Renata is part of this story in a way that Gerald never anticipated. Renata was a property manager I had worked with for 3 years, a meticulous and direct woman in her late 40s who had managed residential portfolios in this market for 2 decades, and who handled the day-to-day operations of my rental properties with a level of efficiency that freed me to focus on my consulting work without the properties becoming a second job. Renata knew my tenants, knew my maintenance contractors, knew which units needed attention 6 months before the attention became urgent. She charged 8% of collected rent and was worth twice that. When I called her the morning after Gerald's Monday evening phone call, before I had driven to the school for the 8:15 meeting, I had asked her one specific question: whether she had received any unusual inquiries about any of the properties in the past 30 days. Renata had paused for exactly 1 beat and said, "Define unusual." I told her what I was watching for. She told me she had not received anything that matched that description, but that she would flag anything going forward. She said it the way Renata said most things, with the economical certainty of someone who has already thought 3 steps past the conversation she is currently having. That call had taken 6 minutes. I had made it from the car, engine running, before driving to Hargrove. Now, in the driveway after the meeting, I called Jonathan. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what Gerald had said. I told him about the footage I had shown him and what the footage contained. There was a pause that had the specific quality of an attorney listening to a situation and reorganizing what he knows about it. He said expulsion. Jonathan's voice was measured. Those were his exact words. Those were his exact words. Does he have documentation supporting that? A formal disciplinary record, a written notice, anything that went through the district office? Nothing that I received. Nothing that was discussed in that meeting. Another pause, shorter. Then what he did this morning was not a formal expulsion. It was a principal telling a parent his intention. There is a process the district requires before a student can be formally expelled from an elementary program, and that process involves a written notice, a parent conference with a record, and in most cases, a review board. He skipped all of it. A brief exhale. I think he expected you to simply accept it and withdraw Theo voluntarily. I thought about the slightly lower chair. Yes, I said. I think that is exactly what he expected. What do you want to do? I want Theo in his classroom tomorrow morning, and I want to understand exactly what Gerald's authority does and does not extend to in a situation where there is documented footage contradicting his account of the incident. Jonathan said he would pull the district's disciplinary guidelines and have something for me by end of day. He said it calmly, the way he said everything, which was one of the reasons I had worked with him for 7 years. I thanked him and ended the call and went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and wrote down, on a legal pad that I kept in the desk drawer specifically for situations that required organized thinking, everything I knew and everything I needed to know, in 2 columns, the way my father had taught me to approach a problem with too many variables. Daniel called at 11:30. He asked how the morning had gone. I told him I had met with his father and that there was a situation we needed to discuss that evening, in full, and that it was serious, but that I had it under control. He was quiet for a moment. What kind of situation? Your father told me he's expelling Theo. The silence on Daniel's end had a specific texture to it, the texture of a man whose instinct toward reasonable interpretation of his father was colliding with something that did not have a reasonable interpretation available. For the playground thing with Lily. He took a breath. I'll be home by 5:30. I know, I said. Take your time. I have things to do before then. I want to tell you about the 3 moments in the months before this when I came closest to having what I had built discovered by the wrong people, because those moments are what made the morning in Gerald's office possible. Each one of them could have gone differently. Each one of them ended with me moving forward. The first was at a Sunday dinner at the Holt house in late winter, 7 months before the playground incident. Beverly had made her standing rib roast, which she made 4 times a year and which the family treated as a small ceremony. There were 8 of us at the table: Gerald, Beverly, Daniel, Theo, Beverly's sister Margaret, who visited twice a year from Phoenix, Renee and her husband Clay, and Lily. The evening was, until approximately halfway through the main course, entirely pleasant. Renee was telling a story about a colleague at the dental school where she taught, and Clay was refilling wine glasses with the easy attentiveness of a man who has learned that being useful at the dinner table costs him nothing. Gerald was in a good mood, the specific good mood he got when the family was assembled around his table and everything was in its correct place. Then Margaret asked me how my work was going. Margaret was Beverly's older sister by 4 years, a retired high school librarian who had the librarian's particular gift for noticing inconsistencies and who asked questions the way she had probably once asked students about their research sources, with a gentle insistence that implied the question was not optional. I had always liked Margaret. She was one of the few people at that table who asked about my work because she was genuinely curious, not because the answer would give her something to evaluate. I told her it was going well, which was true, and that I had been busy with a couple of consulting projects, which was also true, and that I was enjoying the steadiness of the work. All accurate, all incomplete. Margaret tilted her head. Didn't you mention something to me last time about looking at investment properties? That was, I want to say, 2 years ago now. Did anything come of that? The table did not stop. Renee was still listening to Clay describe something about the drive down. Gerald was cutting his meat. Beverly was watching me with the warm attentiveness she brought to all conversational moments, not suspicious, simply present. I set down my fork with the unhurried ease of someone who has been asked a question they find mildly amusing rather than dangerous. "A little bit," I said. "Nothing that turned into anything major. I looked at a couple of things and the numbers didn't work the way I'd hoped." Margit nodded. "Smart to be careful with it. The market has been so strange." "It really has," I agreed, and I picked up my fork and turned slightly toward Renee and asked her something about the dental school that I knew would carry the conversation for at least 4 minutes, and it did. That night, after Theo was asleep and Daniel was reading in bed, I sat at my kitchen desk and reviewed the title documentation on the commercial unit, not because it needed reviewing, but because I needed to confirm, with my eyes on the actual paperwork, that everything was structured correctly. It was. It had been for 2 years. I already knew it. Checking it again was the thing I did to settle my mind, the same way my father used to walk the perimeter of a job site at the end of the day, even when he knew nothing had changed. I signed off on a lease renewal for the physical therapy practice the next morning and emailed the executed document to Renata. Forward. The second close call was more specific and came from a direction I had not expected. Clay, Renee's husband, was a financial advisor at a mid-size wealth management firm. He was good at his job, genuinely good, in the same way Gerald was genuinely good at his, and he had the professional habit of paying attention to money in the way that people who work with it daily do, with a background awareness that was hard to turn off even at family gatherings. He and I had always had a friendly relationship, the friendliness of two professionally competent people who respected each other's work from a comfortable distance. He had never pushed into my finances, and I had never pushed into his. The exception came on a Saturday afternoon in early spring, 4 months before the playground incident. Renee and Clay had come over to use the pool, a warm April afternoon that arrived 2 weeks before the temperature had any business being that high. Theo and Lily were in the water with Clay supervising. Renee and I were on the patio with cold drinks. Daniel was inside starting the grill. Clay came out of the pool to refill his water and stopped near my chair on his way to the table, dripping and relaxed and slightly squinting against the sun. "Hey, random question," he said, with the casualness of something that was not entirely random. "I know you do some property consulting. Have you ever worked with anyone on the financing side of acquisitions? We've been expanding our real estate advisory services, and I'm trying to understand what gaps consultants like you run into." It was a professionally reasonable question. It was the kind of question that, in any other context, I would have been happy to answer in detail, because Clay was smart and the conversation would have been interesting. In this context, it was the kind of question that, if I answered fully, would tell him things about the structure of my practice that I was not ready for the Holt family to know. I leaned back slightly. Most of the clients I work with are pretty well capitalized and come to the financing relationship already established. I'm usually evaluating the asset, not helping structure the deal. I paused. "What kind of advisory expansion are you thinking? More institutional clients or individual wealth management?" Clay took the reframe without breaking stride, which told me he was either satisfied or professionally polite enough not to pursue it. He talked about the institutional side for a few minutes, and I listened with genuine interest. And then Theo called from the pool, and Clay went back to supervising, and Renee said something about whether we needed more ice, and the moment closed. That evening, I sent Jonathan a message flagging the conversation, not as an alert but as documentation. He responded the next morning, "Noted, nothing changes structurally, just good to have on record." I agreed. I had been keeping records of these conversations since the previous year. Not obsessively, just cleanly. The third close call was the one that mattered most, because it was the one that Gerald himself engineered, and because it told me, with a clarity that removed any remaining ambiguity about what I was dealing with, that what I had believed was Gerald's general desire for oversight had evolved. At some point, I could not identify precisely, into something more active. This was 6 weeks before the playground incident in late August. Gerald had called Daniel, not me, and suggested that the three of us, meaning Gerald, Daniel, and I, have lunch together. He phrased it as a chance to talk about Theo's school year before it started, a reasonable framing, the framing of a grandfather and principal who wanted to coordinate. Daniel had relayed the invitation with the mild optimism he brought to all possibilities of family harmony. I had agreed because declining would have required a reason I was not ready to give. We met at a restaurant Gerald liked, a place with good salads and a view of the river, a Tuesday at noon. Gerald was already seated when we arrived. He had ordered water and was looking at the menu with the calm of someone who had decided what he wanted before he got there. The first 20 minutes were genuinely pleasant. Gerald asked about Theo's summer, about whether he was ready to go back, about how the reading had been going. He was good with Theo in this mode, attentive and specific, and I reminded myself, as I did periodically, that his relationship with his grandson was real and not manufactured. Whatever else Gerald was, he loved Theo. The complexity was that his love came with a structure attached, a set of assumptions about how things should be organized and who should be at the center of that organization, and those assumptions had consequences that love did not automatically excuse. Then, between the salads and the entrees, Gerald set his glass down and looked at me with the expression he used when he was about to say something he had prepared. "Nora, I want to ask you something directly." His voice had the quality of a man who believed directness was a virtue he had cultivated, which was interesting given what the question turned out to be. "Daniel tells me you've been putting extra money into Theo's education account, the 529. I held his gaze steadily. "I contribute monthly, yes. We had discussed years ago the possibility of a joint arrangement. Beverly and I were prepared to make a substantial contribution." He paused. We never heard back definitively. Across the table, Daniel shifted slightly, not uncomfortably, just the small movement of a man recalibrating a conversation he had thought was going one direction. "I appreciated the offer," I told Gerald, with a warmth that was entirely honest in its surface temperature. I wanted Theo to have something established in his name, clean and straightforward. I didn't want to complicate the structure. Gerald's chin lifted a fraction. "What kind of contribution are we talking about on your end?" "Ballpark." There it was. The specific question dressed as a grandfather's interest in his grandson's future. I had been waiting for a version of this question for 3 years, and I had prepared for it the way I prepared for most things, by knowing exactly what I was willing to say and being completely comfortable with where the line was. I smiled at him the way I had smiled at him in his office that morning, calm and without apology. "Enough that Theo is going to be fine," I said. "I'll leave it at that." Gerald's expression did not shift in any dramatic way. It shifted in the small way that a face shifts when the answer it received was not the answer that was sought, when the door that was tried did not open. He picked up his water glass. "Of course," he said. "Just a grandfather asking." "Of course," I agreed. That evening, after Daniel and I had put Theo to bed and were sitting in the kitchen with the specific comfortable tiredness of a weekday evening, Daniel said, "My dad really does just want to be involved." I looked at my husband, whom I loved, who was a good man navigating a complicated inheritance, in the family sense and not the financial one. "I know he does," I said. And I meant it, and it was still not an answer to the question Daniel was trying to ask me, and Daniel understood that, and we sat with it quietly the way we had learned to sit with the things between us that didn't have clean resolutions. 2 days later, I called Jonathan and told him about the lunch. He listened without interruption and then said, "Has he made any formal inquiry? Anything in writing?" "No, nothing formal. Keep documenting." A brief pause. "How are you feeling about all of this?" It was a question Jonathan did not ask often. He was not an emotional check-in kind of attorney. The fact that he asked it told me he had heard something in my description of the lunch that warranted it. "I'm building," I said. "I've been building for a long time. I'm not worried." Jonathan's response was 3 words. "Good, stay ready." I stayed ready. For 6 more weeks I stayed ready, and then Theo walked across a playground and picked up a wet book and handed it back to a girl named Adiz Obi. And what I had been building became the thing I needed it to be. By the evening of the day of Gerald's meeting, Jonathan had sent me a 12-page document outlining the district's formal expulsion process, the specific procedural requirements Gerald had bypassed, and a summary of 3 comparable cases from other districts in the state where parental challenges to informal expulsion declarations had resulted in administrative review findings against the principal in question. He had also made a call, which he mentioned only briefly in his email, to a colleague who worked in education law. That colleague's name was Dr. Beatriz Omenka, and she had, according to Jonathan, reviewed the situation and agreed to consult. Beatriz has seen this pattern before, Jonathan wrote, near the end of the email. Principal with long institutional tenure, family connection to the disciplinary matter, procedural shortcuts made in apparent confidence they wouldn't be challenged. She knows exactly what this is. I went through the document at the kitchen table while Theo did his homework next to me, his pencil making the small methodical sounds of a child working carefully through math problems. At one point he looked up and asked what I was reading, and I told him it was work stuff, which was true in the way that mattered, and he nodded and went back to his problems. When Daniel came home at 5:40 and we put Theo to bed early and sat down at the kitchen table with the document between us, I told him everything. All of it. The properties, the trust structure. Jonathan, the lunch in August and what his father had been doing with that question about the 529. The meeting that morning and the footage and what the footage showed Lily doing to Adiz. Daniel listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always loved about him, his capacity to listen to difficult things without reaching for a defense of the person who had caused them before he had heard the full account. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. His hands were flat on the table. He looked at the document Jonathan had sent, not reading it, just looking at it. He tried to expel Theo, Daniel said, not a question. He told me Theo was expelled. No documentation, no process. No written notice, because Theo stood up for a kid that Lily was bullying. Yes. Daniel looked up at me. There was something in his face that I recognized as the specific expression of a man whose love for his father and his understanding of his father had, in that moment, fully separated from each other, the way two things that have been attached for a long time separate when sufficient force is applied. It was not a dramatic expression. It was quiet. It was the expression of someone absorbing something true. "What do you need from me?" he said. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. This was the moment, the one I want to put on record between all the legal documents and the property values and the strategic silences, the moment where what mattered was not any of the architecture I had built, but the fact of my husband's hand under mine and the question he had asked. Not what do we do about my father, not how bad is this. What do you need from me? 8 years of marriage in 4 words. I need you to let me handle this my way, I said. And I need you to trust that the way I've been handling things has been for us, for Theo, not against your family. His hand turned over and held mine back. I know that, he said. I've always known that. Theo went to school the next morning. I drove him myself, walked him to the door, signed in at the front desk, and told Deb at the front desk, pleasantly and clearly, that Theo was expected in Ms. Ibarra's classroom, and that I looked forward to receiving the formal written notice of any disciplinary action, as required by District Policy Section 7, subsection 4, which Jonathan had helpfully highlighted in yellow in the document he had sent the previous evening. Deb wrote something down. Her expression was the expression of a front office administrator who has been at a school long enough to recognize when a situation has moved from informal to formal and who wants no part of the informal version. Gerald did not appear in the hallway that morning. In the car on the way home, Jonathan called. Beatriz reviewed the footage description you sent me, he said. She wants to know if you're willing to take this to the district level. I pulled into my driveway, engine running, the same spot where I had sat the morning before. The oak tree in the front yard was starting to turn, the first edges of orange coming into the green the way color arrives before you're fully ready for it. Yes, I said. Tell her yes. I'll set up the call for Thursday. A brief pause that carried something in it, the specific weight of an attorney who has worked with a client long enough to know the difference between someone who is ready and someone who thinks they are. Nora, you are ready for this. I looked at the tree. I've been ready for a while, Jonathan. I know, he said it the way you say something that is both a confirmation and a beginning. Thursday at 10. I ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of the driveway with the engine ticking down and the morning light coming through the windshield at a low autumn angle. And I thought about Theo at his desk in Ms. Ibarra's classroom, pencil moving, working through whatever the morning's first task was with the careful attention of a child who had been told, by his actions if not his words, that he had done the right thing and that the people who loved him were not going to let it cost him anything. And then I thought about Thursday at 10. And about what Beatriz Ominka had said about patterns she had seen before, and about the footage still saved in 3 separate locations, and about the fact that Gerald Holt had spent 11 years building his authority at Hargrove Elementary, without ever once imagining that the woman sitting in the slightly lower chair across his desk had been quietly, methodically, and without any anger whatsoever, building something that his authority had no reach over at all. Everything Gerald thought he understood about that morning was about to be corrected, in front of every institution he had spent his career believing would defer to him. I want to know if you would have said what I said next, because I still think about it. Thursday at 10 came and went, and it was not the meeting that changed everything. That meeting was what I expected it to be. Precise, professional, and clarifying in the way that a legal consultation is clarifying when the person across the table from you has seen the exact shape of your situation before and can name it without hesitation. Beatriz Omenka had a voice like someone who had testified before administrative boards enough times to have stripped every unnecessary syllable from her speech. And within the first 15 minutes, she had laid out the procedural violations in Gerald's attempted expulsion with the specificity of someone reading from a map she had drawn herself. She confirmed what Jonathan had outlined. She identified 2 additional violations I had not caught. She told me that if Gerald attempted to formalize the expulsion through the district process, she would be prepared to intervene at the review board level, and that the footage I had obtained, combined with the absence of any documentation supporting Gerald's account of the incident, put him in an administratively untenable position. He may not try to formalize it, she said, near the end of the call. Men in his position often don't when they realize the other party is prepared. They hope the informal pressure worked. It didn't, I said. Then we wait and see whether he tries the formal route. A pause. If he does, we are ready. If he doesn't, we have a different kind of problem to think about. I asked her what she meant by a different kind of problem. An 11-year principal at an elementary school who has reason to believe that a particular student's parent is not going to accept his authority, Beatriz said, in the tone of someone identifying a hazard on a map, is a man with 11 years of small, informal tools that don't look like retaliation and function exactly like it. Theo is 8. He has years left in that building. I had already thought about this. I had thought about it the night after the meeting in Gerald's office, lying in the dark while Daniel slept beside me. What do you recommend? Document everything that touches Theo from this point forward. Every grade, every interaction, every conversation with a teacher. Not because it will necessarily be needed, because having it changes the behavior of people who know it exists. That was advice I was already following. I thanked her, ended the call, and added her name and number to the document on my laptop that held Jonathan's contact information, Renata's contact information, and the names of 3 other people I had been collecting, quietly and without announcement, against the possibility of exactly this. Theo came home from school that Thursday afternoon with a drawing he had made for Adiz, a picture of 2 figures standing next to what I was fairly certain was supposed to be a tree, rendered in the specific confident inaccuracy of an 8-year-old's art. He told me he had given it to her at lunch, and that she had said thank you and that they had eaten together. He said it the way he said things he considered settled, as a fact delivered without sentiment, and then he asked if we had anything to eat, and I told him there was fruit in the bowl. And he took an apple and went to do his homework, and that was that. The drawing made me feel something I had not expected to feel in the middle of all of it, something that had nothing to do with legal strategies or property values or the careful architecture of the past 6 years. It made me feel that my son was going to be fine, not because of anything I had built, but because of who he already was. 8 years old and drawing pictures for the kid he stood up for. That mattered more than any of the rest of it. I want to put that on record. The week after the Thursday call was quiet in the way that weather is quiet before it changes. Gerald did not contact me. He did not contact Daniel. Ms. Ibarra sent home a note on Friday of that week, a handwritten note on school stationery in the small, careful cursive of a teacher who still wrote things by hand, saying that Theo had had an excellent week and that she had noticed a lovely friendship developing between him and Adiz and that she was proud of him. I kept the note. I put it in the same folder where I kept the footage documentation and the district policy printout and Jonathan's 12-page summary, not because it was evidence of anything, but because it was true and I wanted to have it. Beverly called me on a Tuesday, 10 days after the meeting in Gerald's office. She called my cell, mid-morning, with the specific timing of someone who has calculated that a call at 10:15 on a Tuesday is less confrontational than a call in the evening when Daniel would be home. Beverly was a strategic woman who had spent 40 years presenting her strategy as intuition, and I had a great deal of respect for the competence of it even when it was directed at me. Her voice was warm and slightly careful, the combination she used when she was navigating something she didn't have clean footing on. She asked how Theo was. I told her he was wonderful. She asked how Daniel was. I told her he was well. Then there was a small pause, the kind that arrives when the preamble has run out. Gerald told me there was a misunderstanding at school, she said, about an incident with the children. I noted the word misunderstanding. I noted the word children, plural, which distributed the situation across Theo and Lily rather than placing it where it belonged. I had expected both of these framings. There was a situation, I said, with the even warmth of someone who has decided that this conversation is going to be brief. It's being handled through the appropriate channels. Of course. Beverly's tone adjusted slightly, the way a hand adjusts its grip when it feels something slipping. I hope we can keep things comfortable for the whole family, for the children especially. That's exactly what I want, I told her, with complete sincerity. For the children especially. She said she was glad and that we should get together soon, and I said that would be lovely, and we ended the call with the surface warmth entirely intact. Two women who understood each other clearly and were choosing, for the moment, to keep the understanding between us rather than on the table. I put my phone down and picked it back up immediately and sent Jonathan a message. Beverly called. Framing as family misunderstanding. No specific ask. Documenting. He responded within the hour. Good. Let it sit. Do not engage Gerald directly. I did not engage Gerald directly. What Gerald did, 2 weeks after the Beverly call and 3.5 weeks after his attempt to expel Theo, was something that Beatriz had named as a possibility and that I had hoped, with the portion of my optimism that still existed, he would not do. He did not formalize the expulsion. He did something smaller and more difficult to contest, the kind of thing that an 11-year principal can do without leaving a clear trail. Theo's Tuesday afternoon library period was reassigned. Not canceled. Reassigned to a different time slot that conflicted with the reading enrichment group that Ms. Ibarra had specifically placed Theo in at the beginning of the year, a group of 6 students who read above grade level and who met twice weekly with a specialist named Mr. Donovan. The reassignment came as a printed schedule adjustment, unsigned, sent home in Theo's folder on a Wednesday. It looked administrative. It looked like the kind of thing that happened when school schedules shifted. It was neither. I know this because I called Mr. Donovan directly that same Wednesday evening and asked him whether the reading enrichment schedule had changed. He told me, with the careful phrasing of a specialist who understood that he was being asked about something with implications above his pay grade, that the schedule had not changed for any other student in the group. Just Theo. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat for a moment with the specific feeling of a person who had hoped to be wrong and was not. Then I called Jonathan. File everything, I said when he picked up. Original timeline, all of it. I want the district complaint filed this week. A brief pause. Formal complaint, understood. His voice had shifted into the register he used when something moved from preparation to action. I'll have Beatriz loop in. This goes to the superintendent's office. Good. Nora, he paused. Once we file, it becomes a district-level matter. Gerald will know it's formal. This accelerates. I know. I looked at the schedule adjustment still sitting on the kitchen counter, a piece of paper that was meant to look like nothing. File it. I had one more call to make before I went to bed that night. I called Renata and asked her to pull the current rent rolls on all 3 properties and send me an updated valuation summary. Not because I needed it for the complaint. Because I wanted to hold, in my hands, the full picture of what I had built, all of it together, before the part of the story where it became visible to people who had spent years not knowing it existed. Renata sent the summary by 9 the next morning. I reviewed it at the kitchen table with my coffee, Theo eating breakfast across from me, and the number at the bottom of the page was not a surprise, but it still did something to my breathing for a moment. The way a thing you have built slowly sometimes reveals its full size only when you step back far enough to see all of it at once. Net equity across the 3 properties, after the outstanding mortgage balances, sat at $740,000. The 529 account, which I had been contributing to for 8 years without interruption, held $63,000 and some change. The consulting practice, which I had kept deliberately small and sustainable, generated enough to cover our household needs comfortably and then some, and I had never needed any of it to be larger than that because the properties had been doing the work that large incomes are supposed to do. I put the summary in the folder. I zipped the folder. I drove Theo to school. Jonathan filed the formal complaint with the district superintendent's office on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, the superintendent's office had acknowledged receipt. By the following Monday, Gerald Holt had been notified that a formal investigation into procedural violations related to a disciplinary action at Hargrove Elementary had been opened, and that he was required to provide documentation supporting the actions he had taken. Gerald called Daniel that Monday evening. Not me, Daniel. I knew about the call because Daniel told me about it immediately afterward, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with his phone face down in front of him, and the specific expression of a man who has just heard his father be something he did not want to hear his father be. "He said you were trying to destroy him," Daniel said, quietly. I met his eyes. "What did you say?" I said that filing a formal complaint about procedural violations was not trying to destroy someone. It was asking for accountability. He paused. He hung up. I reached across and touched his arm. He covered my hand with his. The following Saturday was Beverly's birthday. This had been on the calendar for 2 months. A family dinner at the Holt house, the same 8 people who had been at the rib roast dinner, plus Margaret, who had extended her visit from Phoenix by a week. Beverly turned 67. Gerald had made a reservation at a restaurant that did not fit around a home table, which was how I knew this particular birthday was being used for something, because Beverly's birthday was always at home, and Gerald knew that and had changed it, which meant he wanted a restaurant, which meant he wanted the specific social leverage of a public setting where emotional escalation carried a cost. Daniel asked me, the Wednesday before, whether I wanted to go. I thought about it for exactly 1 evening. I thought about Beatrice's warning about 11 years of informal tools. I thought about the schedule adjustment and what it had been meant to communicate. I thought about what Beverly's face would look like across a restaurant table on her birthday, and what Gerald's face would look like, and what the dinner would be designed to accomplish, and whether attending served Theo's interests or only delayed something that was going to arrive regardless. I told Daniel that I would go, and that I needed him to trust me for the duration of the evening the way I had trusted him for 8 years. Daniel looked at me for a long moment, the look of a man running a calculation, and then he said, "Okay." Just that, one word, "Okay." I called Jonathan the next morning and told him about the dinner. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "You don't have to go." "I know." Another pause. "Are you going with something specific in mind?" "I'm going because Gerald chose a restaurant instead of the house, and I want him to know that the setting doesn't change what I have." I looked out the window at the oak tree in the front yard, fully orange now, October doing its work. He thinks the public setting protects him. I want him to understand that it doesn't. Jonathan made a sound that, for him, was the equivalent of a long exhale. "All right, document the evening if anything happens. I mean everything." "I always do," I said. The restaurant was called Alderton's, a place with low lighting and heavy linen napkins, and the kind of menu where the prices were not printed, a detail that Gerald had almost certainly considered when he made the reservation. We arrived at 7. The table was round, which meant there was no head of it, which was either an oversight or a choice I decided to read as neutral. Beverly was already seated when we arrived, next to Margaret, in a dark blue dress that suited her. She rose when she saw us and hugged Theo first, which she always did, and then Daniel, and then me, with the warmth that was Beverly's most genuine quality regardless of context. Renee and Clay arrived 2 minutes after us. Lily came with them, in a dress that matched the formality of the occasion in the way that 8-year-olds look when they have been carefully dressed by someone who wanted them to make a particular impression. She and Theo sat next to each other at the table with the slightly stiff politeness of 2 children who have been told by their respective parents to be on their best behavior and are both complying and resenting it in equal measure. I watched Lily look at Theo once quickly and look away. I watched Theo look at the bread basket and decide to take a piece, which was the 8-year-old equivalent of deciding to carry on. Gerald arrived last. Not late, not by much, but last, which at a round table with no head created the effect of his arrival as entrance rather than joining. He was in a jacket and tie, which he wore well, and he looked the way he looked when he had decided something, settled and certain in the way that people look when they believe the room is arranged in their favor. He greeted Beverly first, a kiss on the cheek and a hand on her shoulder, and then worked around the table. When he reached me, he offered his hand and I shook it, and he held it for a half-second longer than necessary, which was either a power gesture or a test. I met his eyes and smiled and sat down. The first 40 minutes of the dinner were, in the technical sense, a birthday dinner. Margaret told a story about Beverly at 30 that made everyone laugh. Clay asked Theo about the Detective Raccoon books, and Theo explained the entire plot of the third one with the systematic thoroughness of a child who has found his audience. Daniel ordered a bottle of wine that Gerald immediately noticed and approved of, and the approval was the kind that hoped Daniel would register the approval and feel the warmth of it. I watched all of this. I ate my appetizer. I was in no hurry. It was Gerald who ended the preamble. He did it between the appetizers and the entrees, in the space that restaurant dinners create, when the plates have been cleared and the refills have been poured and the table is in the particular suspended state of waiting. He set down his wine glass and looked across the table at me with the expression of a man who has decided that the controlled setting he arranged entitles him to the conversation he arranged it for. Nora. His voice had the restaurant-appropriate register of someone who is being careful about volume and not about content. I think we should use this evening to clear the air. The table adjusted. Not dramatically. The small adjustments of people who have been at a dinner when the conversation turns and who are recalibrating whether to engage or deflect. Clay's hand moved to his wine glass. Renee looked at her husband and then at her father. Margaret looked at me. Daniel said nothing. He had told me he would trust me. He was keeping his word. Beverly said, "Gerald," with a single syllable's worth of caution. Gerald did not alter course. "There's been a misunderstanding about what happened at school. I think it's important for the family to hear my side of things." I looked at him across the round table with its heavy linens and its unpriced menu. I thought about Beatriz Ominka's voice on the phone, naming the pattern. I thought about the schedule adjustment in Theo's folder, designed to look like nothing. I thought about the slightly lower chair in his office. I picked up my water glass. "Go ahead," I said. He had prepared for resistance or emotion. He had not prepared for invitation. A very small recalibration happened behind his eyes. Then he proceeded. "Theo was involved in an altercation on the playground. As principal, I have the responsibility to maintain order and safety. I made a judgment call. I believe it was the right one." He looked around the table briefly, including the family in the statement, making it a report rather than a defense. "I'm disappointed that a family matter has been escalated to the district level. I think that was unnecessary, and I think it was hurtful." Renee made a sound that was not quite agreement but was adjacent to it, the sound of a daughter who has been told a version of events by her father and has not yet been given reason to doubt it. I set down my water glass. "Can I ask you something?" Gerald spread his hand slightly. "Permitted. When you called me into your office and told me Theo was expelled, did you have any documentation supporting that decision?" A brief stillness. "These things are handled through the appropriate process." "Yes," I said. "They are. That's my question. Did you have documentation?" Across the table, Clay had stopped touching his wine glass. He was listening with the precise attention of a man whose professional life involved reading the structure of financial conversations and who had just heard a question that had a structure he recognized. Gerald's expression settled into the solidity of a man declining to be cross-examined at his wife's birthday dinner. "I think the district process will work itself out." "I agree," I said. "I do too. I want to show you something that I think will help the family understand the full picture." I reached into my bag and took out my phone. Not a laptop this time. My phone, which had the footage pulled up in the Files application, the same footage I had shown Gerald in his office, but also something else. Something that had arrived in my email from the district records office 4 days after my original footage request. A second clip that I had requested separately, from the interior hallway camera, that covered the path from the front office to the main exit, time-stamped at 7:42 in the morning on the day after the playground incident, showing Gerald walking to the school's main security terminal and pulling up the playground footage on the administrator screen. He had watched it. Before he called me, he had watched the footage showing Lily drop Adie's book in the puddle, and he had watched Theo hand it back, and then he had called me and told me my son caused trouble and was expelled. I placed my phone on the table, screen up, facing Gerald. He looked at it. The clip was 12 seconds long. It showed him in his own building on his own administrator terminal, watching the playground. The table was very still. not the performed stillness of a dramatic moment. The actual stillness of people absorbing information that reorganizes what they thought they understood. Beverly leaned forward slightly and looked at the screen. Her expression was not the expression of a woman defending her husband. It was the expression of a woman watching something she had not been told about and trying to understand its shape. Margaret, who had the librarian's instinct for following information to its source, looked from the phone to Gerald and back. Renee looked at her father. Gerald's face did something that I want to describe accurately because it was not simple. It was not a collapse. It was the expression of a man who has understood in a single moment that the story he told himself about what he did and why he did it is now in the same room as the story the evidence tells, and those two stories are not the same story. He looked very briefly like a person rather than a principle. Then the solidity came back, slightly different in texture than before, slightly less certain of its own foundation. "That's not what it looks like," he said. I held his gaze. "What does it look like?" He picked up his wine glass, a gesture that was meant to be collected and arrived slightly off timing. I reviewed the footage as part of standard administrative procedure. I look at incident reports regularly. Clay set his napkin down on the table. "Gerald." His voice was measured, the voice of a man who works with financial documents and has learned to be precise about what the numbers say. The incident wasn't reported until later that morning. The timestamp on that clip is 7:42. There was a silence beat. The first one, genuine and complete. Renee looked at her husband, then at her father. "Dad, when did you actually see that footage?" Gerald's jaw worked slightly, the movement of a man searching for the next framing. "I'm telling you that what happened was in the best interest of the school and of Theo's development." Theo's development. The words came out of me with a quality I had not entirely planned, not loud, not sharp, but carrying something that had been waiting to be carried for longer than this dinner. "You watched footage of your granddaughter knock a child's book into a puddle, and then you called me and told me my son was expelled for causing trouble. I want to be clear that I understand what that is." Beverly put her hand flat on the table, not a dramatic gesture. The gesture of a woman who has been married to someone for a very long time and knows what the gesture means between them. "Gerald, did you see the full footage before you made that call?" His silence was its own answer. "If you are still here, hit like. I need to know you saw that." Renee said quietly from her side of the table, "He told me Theo had started something with Lily. He told me that the same day." She looked at her daughter. Lily was looking at her plate with the fixed attention of a child who understands, with the specific comprehension of 8-year-olds who have been listening to adult conversations their whole lives, that the thing being discussed at this table is the thing she already knows about. "Lily, I want to tell you about what happened next, because it was the moment that changed the texture of the evening from confrontation to something more complicated and more true." Lily looked up from her plate. She looked at her mother, and then at Theo, and then at me, and her face had the expression of a child who has been waiting for this particular moment with a dread that had been building for weeks. She was 8 years old. She was Gerald's granddaughter and Renee's daughter and Theo's cousin, and the child who had dropped a D's book in a puddle. And she was also a child sitting at a birthday dinner watching the adults she trusted the most discover something she already knew. "I did it," she said. Her voice was very small but entirely clear, the way a child's voice is clear when they have decided to stop carrying something. "I took her book. I'm sorry, Theo." The table absorbed this. Theo looked at his cousin with the expression of an 8-year-old who has not been expecting an apology and doesn't know what to do with it. Then he said, in the specific matter-of-fact cadence of a child who considers something settled when it is named correctly, "I know, it was mean." Lily nodded. "I know." Renee put her arm around her daughter and pulled her in, the automatic gesture of a mother, and looked at her father over Lily's head with an expression that had more grief in it than anger, the expression of someone understanding that the person she trusted to protect her child had used the situation instead. Gerald was looking at his granddaughter. Whatever the expression was on his face in that moment, it was not the face of the principal. It was the face of a grandfather who had watched his grandchild, sitting at a birthday dinner table, carry the weight of something he had made heavier than it needed to be. I watched him look at Lily, and I watched something that I think was genuine register in him, the cost of what he had done, not to me, but to the children at that table who had nothing to do with his architecture of control. Beverly's hand was still flat on the table. "Gerald." Her voice had lost the careful warmth it carried in almost every other circumstance I had heard it use. What remained was something underneath the warmth, older than the warmth, the voice of a woman who has kept a particular silence for a very long time and has just decided, in a restaurant with linen napkins and no prices on the menu, that she has finished keeping it. "You need to fix this." Clay leaned back in his chair slightly, the posture of a man who has decided his role in this particular exchange is to witness rather than intervene, and who is making that decision out of wisdom rather than indifference. Margaret, on the other side of Beverly, looked at the table. She had the expression of a woman who had spent her career helping people understand the significance of primary sources, and who was watching a primary source sitting across the table being asked to account for itself. Gerald looked at his wife, then at me. "What do you want?" he said. The question had the specific quality of a man who has run out of framings and is asking directly, not out of humility but out of tactical recalibration, because the framings have not worked and he is looking for the terms. I looked at him. 8 years of dinners and the slightly lower chair and the quarterly management of distance. The Walt the contractor call, the joint account that was supposed to come with oversight. The lunch in August and the question about Theo's 529. The 11 days between the playground incident and the phone call. The footage he watched and the call he made anyway. "I want Theo's enrichment schedule restored to what Ms. Ibarra said at the beginning of the year," I said, "by Monday morning. I want a written acknowledgement from the district that the expulsion declaration was procedurally invalid, which the district will provide because the complaint is already filed and the documentation supports it. And I want Adiz Obi's family to receive a formal apology from the school for the month of incidents on that playground that were never addressed before it escalated." Gerald's expression moved through several stages in a short space of time. The first was the stage of a man assessing whether any of those demands were refusable. The second was the stage of a man understanding that the complaint already filed with the district meant the first two were going to happen regardless of what he agreed to tonight. The third was something quieter. He looked at the mention of Adiz's family, and something shifted, small and real, in the area of his face where things shift when something has gotten past the defense. "The Obi family," Beverly said, before Gerald could answer. "Of course." She looked at her husband with the directness of a woman who has been a principal's wife for 3 decades and understands what public accountability costs and who will pay it. "That goes without saying." "It should have gone without saying before now," I said, and I kept my voice even when I said it because I was not performing anything in that moment. I was just saying what was true. Daniel had been quiet through most of this. Not the quiet of absence. The quiet of a man sitting beside his wife and watching his father be fully seen for the first time in a context that didn't allow the usual rearrangements. He reached under the table and covered my hand with his, the same gesture from the kitchen table, and I held it. Gerald looked at his son. The look had something in it that is hard to name, the look of a father understanding that his son's loyalty has a location and that the location is not where Gerald had assumed it was. It was not a cruel understanding. It was simply accurate. "I'll call the district Monday morning," Gerald said. "Jonathan Farrow will be expecting the call," I replied. "He's copied on the complaint." The name landed on Gerald the way names land when they arrive in a context that tells you they have been there longer than you realized. He looked at me with a recalibration happening behind his eyes, the reassembly of a picture of the past weeks that now included an attorney he had not known was involved. "How long?" he said, not finishing the question, because the end of the question was obvious to everyone at the table. I had one more thing to say. I looked at him across the round table, at the man who had spent 7 years of my marriage being certain that his authority extended further than it did, who had watched footage of his granddaughter and called me anyway, who had moved my son's enrichment schedule 2 lines down a printed page and expected it to go unanswered. "Long enough," I said, "to make sure that everything I built is clean, documented, and completely outside the reach of anyone who didn't help build it." The table held that sentence for a long moment. Not the performed stillness of people waiting for their cue, but the genuine stillness of people recalibrating everything they thought they had understood about the architecture of the past several years. Gerald looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not the polished neutrality of the principal's office, not the managed warmth of Sunday dinners. Something underneath both of those, something exposed, the expression of a man who has spent a long time building a particular story about the people in his life and has just been shown, gently and without cruelty, that the story was missing a large portion of its subject matter. "What exactly have you built?" His voice was quieter than it had been all evening. Not aggressive. Almost genuinely curious, in the way that people ask questions when the answer has stopped being something they think they can control. I had thought about how to answer this question, not because I needed to rehearse it, but because the how of it mattered. There is a way to answer that question that is a performance, a reveal designed for maximum impact, the kind of answer that makes the person asking it feel small. I did not want that. Small was not what I was trying to make Gerald feel. What I was trying to make him understand was that the version of me he had been managing for 7 years was a version he had assembled from what I allowed him to see, and that the full picture was different, and that the difference had implications going forward. "I own 3 investment properties," I said, calmly and without decoration. "A residential duplex, a commercial unit near the university, and a long-term rental. Net equity across all 3 is just under $750,000. They're held in a limited liability company in my name, structured by Jonathan Farrow's office over the past 4 years. Theo is the trust beneficiary of those assets, administered by me as sole trustee." I let that sit for exactly 1 breath. No other family member has any standing or access. The sentence at the end was not delivered as a threat. It was delivered as a fact. The distinction mattered to me, and I believe it registered correctly, because what moved across Beverly's face was not the expression of a woman who felt attacked, but the expression of a woman who was doing very fast arithmetic about the past 7 years and arriving at a sum she had not expected. Clay was the one who broke the silence. He did it the way financially literate people break silences involving numbers they want to verify, with a question rather than a statement. "The commercial unit near the university," he said slowly. "The physical therapy practice on Garfield?" "Yes." He absorbed this. Then he looked at Gerald with the expression of a man who has just understood that information he assumed was available to him was in fact not available at all, and that this had been true for longer than he realized. Clay was not a bad person. He had always treated me with professional respect, and I believe he respected me more in that moment than he ever had before, which is the particular irony of revelation in these situations. The person who was underestimated turns out to have been doing the most interesting work in the room. Renee had her arms still around Lily. She looked at her father with an expression that was doing several things at once. Processing the financial picture I had just laid out, accounting for the conversation Gerald had presumably had with her about me over the years, and measuring those 2 things against each other. Renee was not unintelligent. She had spent her career in academic dentistry, which requires precision and an absence of wishful thinking. She was now applying that precision to her father's version of events and finding the version incomplete. "Dad," her voice was careful, the voice of someone choosing words specifically. "Did you actually believe Theo had done something wrong? Or did you call Nora in because you wanted leverage?" The question landed with the specific weight of a question asked by a daughter who knows her father well enough to know the answer and is asking anyway because the answer needs to be in the room. Gerald did not answer immediately. The pause itself was an answer of a kind. Beverly had been quiet for several minutes. Beverly, who ran the room at every gathering through warmth and attention and the management of emotional temperature, had been sitting with her hand flat on the table and her eyes moving between her husband and me with the specific expression of a woman, assembling something she had been avoiding assembling for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. Stripped of the warmth, not because the warmth was false, but because the warmth had been set aside deliberately, the way you set aside a tool when you need your hands free. "He called me the night of the playground incident," Beverly said. "Not to me, to the table, to the family. He told me Theo had been aggressive. He said he needed to handle it carefully because of how Nora was." She paused. "I asked him what he meant by how Nora was. He said she was difficult about boundaries." Another pause, longer. "I did not ask enough questions. I should have." Gerald looked at his wife. It was the look of a man who had relied, for a very long time, on a particular kind of support, and who was watching that support make a public accounting of itself in a way he had not anticipated. "Beverly." His voice had the quality of a warning dressed as a name. "No." Beverly's hand lifted from the table and came back down again. "I called Nora and used the word misunderstanding. I did that." I am telling you now that I did it because you asked me to, and I am telling you that I should not have, and I am telling Nora that directly." She looked at me across the table, and Beverly Holt's eyes, which were usually the warmest thing in any room she occupied, were entirely clear. "I'm sorry, Nora. I should have asked better questions before I made that call." I held her gaze. "I know you were trying to hold things together," I said. And I meant it, because I did know that. And I did not want Beverly's genuine love for her family weaponized against her in this moment, which is what would have happened if I had received the apology as victory rather than as what it actually was: a woman being honest at some personal cost. "I appreciate you saying that." Margaret, who had been listening with the still attention of someone who has spent a career distinguishing between what is said and what is meant, looked at Gerald and said, with the direct plainness of a woman who has no role in the family's political arrangements and therefore no incentive to manage them, "Gerald, you should have called Renee the minute you looked at that footage and seen what Lily did. That was the first thing you should have done." Gerald looked at his sister-in-law. The look had in it the particular discomfort of a man being addressed correctly by someone whose opinion he could not dismiss on structural grounds. Margaret was not his child, not his employee, not his daughter-in-law. She was Beverly's sister, present by love rather than hierarchy, and her assessment carried the weight of someone with nothing to manage and nothing to protect. He turned back to me. Whatever the next thing he said was going to be, I watched him discard 3 versions of it before he arrived at the one he used. "I mishandled it," he said. The words came out with the specific difficulty of words that a person has spent decades not saying about themselves, words that do not come naturally because the self-image they contradict is load-bearing. He did not embellish it. He did not follow it with a but. He said it, and then he was quiet, and the quiet had the texture of something real. I let the quiet exist for a full breath. Then I said what I had come to say, the final thing, the one that was not about the properties or the complaint or the procedural violations or any of the architecture I had spent 6 years building. "I have never wanted anything from you except for Theo to be treated as what he is," I said. "Your grandson, who did the right thing on a playground and deserved to be told that by the one adult at his school with the most authority to say it." Gerald's face did something that I am going to describe as accurately as I can, because I think it matters that I describe it accurately. It did not collapse. It did not become something simple or easy to categorize. What it did was change, in the way that faces change when the story a person has been telling about themselves comes into contact with a version of events that is more true, and the contact is too direct and too witnessed to be deflected. He looked at me, and then he looked at Theo, who was sitting next to his cousin at the end of the table with his bread and his water, and the patient waiting of a child who understands that the adult world is doing something complicated, but has learned to let it complete itself. Gerald looked at his grandson for a long time. Then he said, to Theo, directly and without the management he brought to everything else that evening, "I'm sorry, Theo. I should have told you that you did well." Theo looked at his grandfather with the clear, uncomplicated assessment of an 8-year-old who is deciding whether an apology is real. He considered it for a moment that felt much longer than it probably was. Then he said, "Okay, Grandpa," and reached for another piece of bread. I had been holding my breath without knowing it. I let it out slowly. The tightness across my shoulders, which had been there since 7:15 in the morning on the day Gerald called me into his office, released in a way that was entirely physical, the specific release of a body that has been braced for a long time and has just been told it can stop. The dinner continued. Beverly's birthday cake arrived, chocolate with raspberry filling because that was what she had liked for 30 years, and Margaret told another story, and Clay helped Lily cut her slice because the pieces were large and she was 8. Daniel kept his hand on mine under the table for most of the rest of the evening. Not dramatically, just there. The drive home was quiet. Theo fell asleep in the backseat 8 minutes after we pulled out of the parking lot, the abrupt and total sleep of a child who has spent an evening behaving well and has used up everything he had. Daniel drove. I watched the streetlights go past through the passenger window and felt, not triumph, not even the particular satisfaction I had expected, but something quieter and more solid than either of those things. The feeling of a structure that had been tested and had held. "How long did you know it might come to this?" Daniel said, about 10 minutes from home. I thought about the exact honest answer. "Since the lunch in August, maybe before, maybe since Walt the contractor." He absorbed this. You didn't tell me. I was protecting you from having to choose before you needed to. He was quiet for a moment. Did you think I'd choose wrong? I looked at him. No, I said. I thought you'd carry it, and you didn't need to carry it yet. He reached over and put his hand on mine, the third time that evening, and kept it there until we got home. The formal written acknowledgement from the district arrived on Wednesday of the following week, 7 days after the dinner. It confirmed, in the specific language of administrative findings, that the disciplinary declaration made by the principal of Hargrove Elementary regarding student Theodore Scott Holt on the date in question had not followed required district procedure, that no expulsion was in effect, and that the student's enrollment and placement were fully restored, including all enrichment programming. Jonathan called me when it came through. His voice had the contained satisfaction of a man who does not celebrate loudly, but who is pleased when things are resolved correctly. It's clean, he said. Everything is filed. It's done. Adiz Obi's family received a formal written apology from the school within the same week, accompanied by a meeting with Ms. Ibarra and the district's student wellness coordinator, in which the pattern of playground incidents was addressed directly and a monitoring plan was put in place. I know this because Adiz's mother, a woman named Chiamaka, who I met briefly at a school event 2 weeks later, stopped me in the parking lot and thanked me. I told her Theo would be very glad it was resolved, and she told me her daughter had been dreading school for a month and had come home the previous Thursday singing. I drove home from that parking lot with my eyes doing something I had not expected them to do, and I sat in the driveway for a few minutes in the familiar way before going inside. Gerald Holt submitted his resignation to the district superintendent's office on the last Friday of November, 6 weeks after the dinner. The timing was framed as an early retirement, and the district accepted it on those terms without elaboration. I do not know the full internal conversation that preceded it. I know that the formal complaint I had filed was part of the district's administrative record, and that an 11-year principal's first formal complaint in his final year of tenure, combined with the documented procedural findings, creates a particular kind of institutional context in which the word retirement can mean several things at once. Gerald and Beverly moved to a smaller house on the south side of the city in January, closer to Renee and Clay. From what Daniel tells me, Gerald has taken up woodworking in a serious way, and Beverly's book club meets at their new house on the first Thursday of every month. I find, when I think about them, that what I feel is not resentment. What I feel is the specific neutrality that arrives when a situation has been resolved and the people in it have been allowed to land somewhere with some dignity intact. Renee and I did not become close in the way that dramatic resolutions sometimes suggest. We became more honest. She called me in December, a few weeks after Gerald's resignation, and said, "I don't think I understood what was happening. I should have looked at it more carefully." I told her I appreciated her saying so. We had Christmas together, all of us, at Beverly and Gerald's new house, and it was quieter than previous years, and also, in a way I had not expected, more real. Lily and Theo spent the afternoon in the backyard with a soccer ball that Clay inflated and a dog belonging to the neighbors that came through the fence to investigate. Lily is not a bad child. She was a child with a grandfather who had arranged the world so that she did not experience consequences for a month of unkindness. That arrangement has since been rearranged. Theo finished 2nd grade in June. Ms. Ibarra wrote in his final report that he had demonstrated exceptional empathy and a strong sense of community accountability, which is teacher language for what I would describe as simply being the person he has always been. He and Adiz still eat lunch together most days. He is 9 now and has moved on to the 5th Detective Raccoon book and has informed me that the series has a total of 9 installments and that he intends to read all of them before the end of summer, a timeline he appears to be taking seriously. My 3 properties are fully tenanted. Renata sends me the monthly reports, and I review them on Sunday mornings with coffee before the rest of the house wakes up. The 529 account for Theo passed $70,000 this spring and is growing in the quiet way that things grow when you have been contributing to them steadily for years without disruption. I took on 2 new consulting clients in the first quarter of this year and turned down a third because the numbers on the property they wanted evaluated did not hold up the way they needed to. My name is still Nora Scott. It will continue to be. What I know is this: I did not build any of it out of anger. I built it the way my father built things, because building correctly is what you do with the time and the capacity that you have, and because the thing you build with your own hands stays yours. That Gerald spent years treating my silence as compliance is a story about Gerald, not about me. My silence was never compliance. It was a foundation being laid in a place he did not know to look. The one thing I still think about, when I think about all of it, is Theo's face when Gerald looked at him across that birthday table and said he was sorry. The way Theo considered it with his full attention for a moment and then said okay and reached for the bread. The ease of it. The 8-year-old completeness of it. I have spent my adult life building structures designed to protect him, and I am glad I built them and I would build them again. But the thing that settled me, finally and fully, in the car on the drive home with his small sleeping face in the rearview mirror and Daniel's hand on mine, was that Theo did not need the structures the way I had needed to build them. He had already moved on. He was already fine. He had been fine since he walked across a playground and picked up a wet book and handed it back. So tell me, Gerald got his consequence, the footage did its job, and I would do every part of it again the same way. But some people in my family think I should have confronted him privately first, before filing the district complaint. Did I escalate too fast, or did he give up the right to a private conversation the moment he moved Theo's schedule? Tell me what you think.